The wind on Seraphis was different from anything Arya had known in her sheltered life as the crown princess. It wasn't the gentle, fragrant breeze that swept through the marble halls of the royal palace. No, here in the northern wilderness, it cut through the thick, tangled underbrush like a living thing biting at her skin and howling through the canopy of towering trees. Each gust seemed to mock her fall from grace, once the most powerful woman on the planet, now a fugitive, a hunted outcast. Her legs trembled as she stumbled through the dense foliage, her breath ragged and shallow, each inhale burning her lungs. Blood sticky and warm trickled down her arm, staining the rich blue of her skin a deeper shade where the wound festered. She had been running for hours, maybe days. Time had become a blur, her senses dulled by fatigue and the constant dread of being discovered. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent her heart racing with a renewed revolt of fear. She should have known. She should have seen it coming. Cadus, her trusted advisor, had always been ambitious, always whispered about ways to strengthen the kingdom. She'd foolishly believed his promises, even let him into her inner circle. And then with a smile as sharp as the blade now buried in her heart, he had orchestrated the coup. Her people, the ones she'd been raised to protect, now hunted her like a common criminal. Arya's foot caught on a vine, and she collapsed to the ground, the sudden impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, too exhausted to rise, the damp earth cool against her cheek. For a fleeting second, the thought of giving up crossed her mind. What was the point? Even if she survived, there was no kingdom to return to, no home waiting for her. Everything she had once known was gone, taken in a single night of treachery. No, her mind hissed back, this isn't the end, you are not done. Her fingers dug into the soil, pulling herself back to her knees, then her feet. She had no plan, no allies, but she had something else. She had fury. Cadus might have stolen her throne, but he had not yet broken her spirit. She would survive this. She had to. Arya wiped the dirt from her face, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. But just as she began to move again, a sound stopped her cold footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone was approaching, their presence cutting through the quiet stillness of the forest like a predator stalking its prey. She pressed herself against the trunk of a massive tree, holding her breath. The blood pounding in her ears drowned out everything else as the footsteps grew closer. Whoever it was, they were skilled, moving with a calculated grace that suggested experience in hunting, perhaps one of Cadus's assassins sent to finish the job. Her hand moved instinctively to the blade strapped to her thigh, the only weapon she had left. If it came to it, she would fight, though she knew in her current state she stood little chance, but she wouldn't go down without taking at least one of them with her. The footsteps stopped. Silence hung thick in the air, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Arya's muscles tensed, her body coiled, ready to strike, and then he appeared. From the shadows of the forest, a figure stepped into the faint light filtering through the trees. He was tall, his silhouette framed by the dying glow of the setting sun. His movements were deliberate, but there was something different about him, something that set him apart from the faceless assassin she had been fleeing. This man was human. But for a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Arya's eyes flicked over his form, taking in the rugged lines of his face, the weariness in his eyes, and the scars that marred his skin, hinting at battles hard won and losses endured. He carried a blaster at his hip and a knife strapped to his chest, but he made no move for either. "Who are you?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The man's eyes met hers, and something flickered in them, curiosity perhaps, or recognition. But there was no malice, no immediate threat. He looked her over carefully, his gaze lingering on the blood staining her arm. "Would I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. There was a weight to his words, as though he hadn't spoken to another person in a long time. "But let's skip the introductions for now. You're hurt." Arya tensed, her hand tightening around hers, a luxury she couldn't afford. "Not here, not now." "I don't need your help," she bit out, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the lie. The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by her bravado. "Maybe, but you're not going to last long out here on your own." Arya's pride flared, and for a moment she considered brushing him off, turning her back and disappearing into the wilderness once more. But her body betrayed her legs, weakened by exhaustion and blood loss, refused to obey. She swayed, and before she could stop herself, her knees buckled beneath her. In an instant, the man was at her side, catching her before she could hit the ground. His grip was firm, but not rough, steadying her with practiced ease. "Easy," he muttered, his tone softening ever so slightly. "And you're not going anywhere like this?" Her first instinct was to push him away, to demand that he leave her alone, but she couldn't. Her body had given up on her, and the reality of her situation crashed down like a tidal wave. She was dying, and without help, she wouldn't make it through the night. Reluctantly, Arya let herself lean into his hold, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "I don't even know your name," she managed, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Ethan," he said simply, his expression unreadable. He glanced around the forest, his sharp eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. "And you?" For a moment she considered lying, giving him a false name to protect her identity, but something in his eyes, a quiet sincerity she hadn't expected, made her pause. If he had wanted to kill her, he could have done so already. He wasn't one of Cadus's assassins. "Aria," she said quietly, allowing herself the briefest flicker of trust. Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned his attention to her wound. "Let's get you out of here, Aria. I'll patch you up, and then we can figure out what to do next." She wanted to protest, to tell him that she didn't need saving, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they moved through the forest, his arm steadying her, Aria couldn't shake the feeling that her life, as shattered as it was, had taken a new turn, one she had never anticipated. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the faintest glimmer of hope. The light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground as Ethan led Aria through the thick underbrush. Each step they took felt heavier than the last, the weight of exhaustion bearing down on them both. They had been walking for hours now, the silence between them punctuated only by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Aria's mind was a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. Her body screamed for rest, for respite from the relentless journey, but her spirit remained alert, wary of this human who had inexplicably come to her aid. Who was he, really? Why was he helping her? A complete stranger on a hostile alien world? She stole a glance at him, trying to read his face for any hint of ulterior motives. Ethan walked ahead of her, his broad shoulders and steady gait betraying none of the uncertainty she felt. His dark hair, unkempt and streaked with gray, framed a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of hardship. Scars crisscrossed his exposed arms, evidence of battles fought long before they'd crossed paths. Yet despite the weariness etched into his features, there was a calmness in him, a quiet determination that made her want to trust him, even when she knew she shouldn't. The wound on her arm throbbed with every movement, a constant reminder of her vulnerability. She had been trained in self-defense, in the art of leadership, but here, in the wild, wounded and without her kingdom, she was little more than prey. The thought gnawed at her pride. How had it come to this? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan stopped. He motioned to a small clearing just ahead, a place where the trees parted slightly to reveal a patch of open sky. "We can rest here for a bit," he said, his voice low and measured. "It's far enough from the main paths, and we'll be able to see anyone coming." Aria hesitated before nodding, her legs betraying her need for rest. As she lowered herself onto a fallen log, she winced, the pain from her wound flaring up again. Ethan noticed and knelt beside her, his brow furrowing in concern. Without a word, he pulled a small medkit from his pack and began tending to the gash on her arm. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his fingers working with precision as he cleaned the wound and applied a fresh bandage. Aria watched him in silence, her mind racing. This wasn't the behavior of a man with malicious intent. He hadn't tried to pry into her past, hadn't asked any probing questions. He had simply helped, and for the first time in days she felt the smallest flicker of safety. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words foreign on her tongue. It had been a long time since she had needed to thank anyone. Ethan glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just doing what needs to be done." He paused, then added, "But you're welcome." They sat in silence for a few moments longer, the soft sounds of the forest around them filling the space between their thoughts. Aria found herself watching Ethan more closely now, studying his movements, the way he carried himself. There was something different about him. He was human, yes, but there was a depth to him that she hadn't expected. He wasn't like the other humans she had encountered, those who came to Sci-Fi seeking profit or adventure, who viewed her family as curiosities. He seemed like a man who had lost something, though she couldn't quite place what. "You're not from here?" she said, finally breaking the silence. Ethan glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "Obviously." "I mean," she continued, "you don't act like the other humans who come to Sci-Fi's. Most of them would have left me to die back there or worse." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not like most humans." Aria waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up, pacing a few steps away before turning to face her. There was something guarded in his expression now, a wall she hadn't noticed before. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, unable to keep the question bottled up any longer. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. So why?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, that he would continue to keep his past hidden behind that wall of silence. But then something shifted in his gaze, a brief flicker of vulnerability. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said quietly. His voice was low, but there was a weight to his words that hit Aria like a physical blow. "I've been where you are, Aria, lost alone, not knowing who to trust. I couldn't save the people I cared about back then, but maybe I can save you." The admission left her stunned, her mind reeling with questions she didn't know how to ask. She had expected many things from him, stoicism, perhaps, or indifference, but not this, not empathy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Arya didn't know what to say. She had been surrounded by people her whole life, yet no one had ever understood her the way this stranger seemed to. The crown had isolated her, turned her into a symbol more than a person, but here in the wilderness with Ethan, she was just Arya broken, lost, and searching for something she didn't even know she needed. Ethan must have sensed her internal turmoil because he sat back down beside her, his voice softening. Look, I don't expect you to trust me right away. I know how it feels to be betrayed by the people you thought you could count on. But out here, we don't have much of a choice. We're all each other's God. Trust, the word hung between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Arya had once trusted Cadis, trusted her advisors, trusted her people, and it had cost her everything. But Ethan wasn't Cadis. He wasn't part of her world, didn't have any stake in her kingdom. Maybe that was why she wanted to believe him. Trust is earned, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan nodded, as if he understood the weight of her words. Then let me earn it. They spent the next few hours in relative silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Ethan kept watch, his eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of danger, while Arya rested, her body still aching from the ordeal. She tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't let her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cadis's face, the cold, calculating smile he had given her just before everything had fallen apart. Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. You mentioned earlier that the humans who come to Seraphis are different. What did you mean? Arya hesitated, unsure of how much she should reveal, but then again, what did it matter? She had already lost everything. Most of the humans who come here are traders, smugglers, or mercenaries. They see Seraphis as a place to exploit, to take what they can and leave the rest. My people, we've always been wary of outsiders. Is that why you didn't trust me? She glanced at him, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of her lips, among other reasons. Ethan chuckled, a sound that was surprisingly warm. Fair enough. The conversation lulled again, but this time, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't heavy with suspicion or fear, it was comfortable. Arya found herself relaxing, if only slightly. Maybe, just maybe, she could let her guard down at least for a little while. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in deep hues of orange and gold, Ethan stood and offered her his hand. We should keep moving. We need to find somewhere safer before nightfall. Arya hesitated for only a second before taking his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. His grip was firm, steady, and as their eyes met, she felt something shift between them, a fragile thread of trust beginning to form. They continued their journey in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but of two people who understood that their fates were intertwined. Neither knew where the path ahead would lead, but for the first time in days, Arya didn't feel entirely alone. As they walked side by side through the twilight, a thought crossed her mind, one that surprised her with its intensity. Perhaps in the ashes of everything she had lost, there was still something left to be found. The forest stretched before them like an endless maze, each towering tree and thick cluster of foliage a reminder of just how far they were from any kind of civilization. The air was cool now, with the last traces of daylight retreating into the horizon. Night would come soon, and with it the creatures of Seraphis that hunted in the dark. Arya had grown up hearing stories of the shadow wolves that roamed these parts, their eyes glowing in the darkness, their claws silent as death. She didn't know if the stories were true, but she wasn't eager to find out. Ethan led the way with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the path ahead, ever alert. He moved with the precision of a soldier, each step measured, each breath controlled. Arya had watched him long enough now to understand that everything he did had a purpose. He wasn't the kind of man to waste energy, and in a strange way that reassured her, he wasn't reckless. He wouldn't get them killed. The silence between them, once heavy with uncertainty, had begun to shift into something more comfortable, though neither of them had acknowledged it aloud. They didn't need to. The understanding between them had deepened with every passing hour, an unspoken agreement that for now they were in this together. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, Ethan slowed his pace, his eyes narrowing as he examined their surroundings. We need to find shelter, he said, his voice low but firm. It'll be dark soon. Arya nodded, though a part of her bristled at being told what to do. She had spent her entire life giving orders, not following them, and yet here she was, relying on a stranger, a human, no less, to keep her alive. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but she had no choice. Out here in the wilderness, her title meant nothing. All that mattered was survival. Ethan veered off the main path, leading her toward a cluster of large rocks that jutted out from the side of a hill. He examined the area for a moment before nodding in satisfaction. This'll do, he muttered, setting his pack down and kneeling to clear a space for them to rest. We'll be sheltered from the wind here, and the rocks will give us some cover. Arya lowered herself onto one of the flatter stones, her body protesting with every movement. The wound on her arm had stopped bleeding, but the pain was still a constant throb, a dull ache that refused to let her forget her vulnerability. She watched as Ethan worked, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he built a small fire, careful to keep the flames low so as not to attract unwanted attention. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow over the clearing. For a moment, the flickering light painted Ethan's face in sharp relief, illuminating the lines of weariness that seemed permanently etched into his features. He sat down across from her, his expression unreadable, though there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. "You're not used to this, are you?" he asked, breaking the silence. Arya blinked, caught off guard by the question. She wasn't sure if he was referring to the wilderness or her current situation as a whole, but either way the answer was the same. "No," she admitted, her voice softer than she intended. "Not like this." He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "It's different when you're out here alone. No backup. No one to give orders to. You have to rely on yourself. It's humbling." "Humbling," she repeated, tasting the word. It wasn't one she was accustomed to. "I've been giving orders since I was a child. When I was trained to lead, to rule, humility was never part of the curriculum." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound low and almost bitter. "Funny thing about leadership," he said, his gaze fixed on the fire, "it's a lot easier to give orders when you're safe behind palace walls. Out here, it's different. Out here, you have to earn it." His words stung more than Arya cared to admit. She had spent her entire life preparing to rule, but now, stripped of her title, her power, her people, she was beginning to understand just how fragile that power had always been. Leadership wasn't about commanding armies or making speeches. It was about survival, hers and Ethan's. "What about you?" she asked, her curiosity finally breaking through the wall she had erected around herself. "And you move like a soldier. You act like someone who's been through this before. Who are you really, Ethan?" He didn't answer immediately, his eyes still locked on the flames. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken memories. Arya waited, sensing that this was not a question he had been asked often and even less frequently answered. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I was a soldier," he said quietly, his voice laced with a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. "Earth had its wars, just like every other place. I fought in them, did things I'm not proud of. When it was over, I left. Came out here to the fringes of space, looking for something. I don't know what exactly. Maybe just peace?" Arya studied in the firelight, her mind racing to fill in the gaps. She had heard stories of Earth's wars, the endless conflicts that had driven humanity to the stars in search of a fresh start. But what was left behind? Men like Ethan, broken, haunted, running from a past they couldn't escape. "You didn't find it, did you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's lips twisted into a grim smile. "No," he admitted. "Not even close." They sat in silence for a long while, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. Arya wanted to ask more to understand this man who had become her unexpected companion, but she sensed that this was all he was willing to give for now, and that was enough. The night deepened around them, the shadows growing long and dark as the fire began to die down. Ethan stood, stretching his arms before glancing at the sky. "We'll take shifts," he said, his voice returning to its usual matter-of-fact tone. "I'll take the first watch, you get some rest." Arya hesitated, unsure if she could truly relax enough to sleep, but her body was already betraying her. The exhaustion was pulling her down, and the pain in her arm had dulled to a distant throb. She nodded. Lying down on the blanket Ethan had given her, her eyes drifting shut, despite her efforts to stay alert. As she lay there, the firelight flickering on the edge of her vision, she found herself thinking about Ethan's words about earning trust, about survival. She had spent her entire life being protected, sheltered, told that she was destined for greatness. But what had that greatness amounted to now? She was lost, broken, without a kingdom or a throne. And yet, with Ethan beside her, she felt a strange sense of possibility. The fire crackled softly, and in the darkness of the wilderness, Arya let herself slip into the first peaceful sleep she had known in days. Arya woke to the sound of footsteps. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensing immediately. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow over the clearing. Ethan stood at the edge of the camp, his back to her, his body rigid with alertness. Something was wrong. She rose silently, her instincts screaming at her to be ready for whatever was coming. Ethan's hand was on the hilt of his knife, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the trees. Arya followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the glint of movement in the darkness. "Stay low," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Arya crouched, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps were getting closer now, too close to be a coincidence. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't friendly. She felt for the blade at her side, her fingers curling around the hilt. As she prepared for a fight she wasn't sure she could win. Ethan moved swiftly, positioning himself between her and the approaching figures. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange she saw something that sent a chill down her spine. This was no ordinary danger. Before she could react, the shadows burst from the trees and all hell broke loose. The attack was swift, a sudden rush of movement in the dim light of the forest. Shadows darted between the trees, blending into the wilderness before emerging with deadly precision. Arya barely had time to register the masked figures descending on them before the fight erupted into chaos. Ethan reacted instantly, his instincts kicking in. He moved like a well-oiled machine, a blade in one hand and his body tense with combat readiness. His first attacker lunged, but Ethan sidestepped with ease, swinging his knife in a quick, precise arc. The figure dropped soundlessly to the ground, but more were closing in. Too many. Arya's heart pounded, the blood in her veins rushing with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. She pulled out her own blade, gripping it tightly, though her fingers trembled with the unfamiliar weight of it. This wasn't the careful training she had undergone in the palace. This was raw, brutal survival. The second attacker came at her quickly, a blur of black armor and sharp steel. She blocked his first strike, barely managing to hold her ground, and swung her blade wildly in response. The man dodged, his movements fluid and practiced, and Arya realized with a sinking feeling that she was outmatched. Her training had never prepared her for this real combat, real danger. But there was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Keep moving. Ethan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. She couldn't let herself be frozen by fear. With a desperate cry, she lunged forward, her blade aiming low. Her attacker sidestepped, but she managed to graze his leg, the blow enough to stagger him. She swung again, this time catching him in the side, and he dropped to his knees. But there were others. Shadows moving at the edge of her vision, closing in on them. Arya's mind raced, trying to calculate their next move, but her body was already flagging. Her wound throbbed painfully, slowing her movements. "Ethan," she shouted, her voice shaking with urgency. I turned, locking eyes with her for a split second, enough to tell her he had a plan, but not enough to know what it was. Ethan blocked another attacker's swing with his forearm and kicked the man back before moving toward her. "There's too many." Arya said, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "Run," he barked. They bolted through the underbrush, the shadows of their pursuers flitting between the trees behind them. Arya's lungs burned with the effort, but she pushed herself to keep moving. Ethan was just ahead, leading them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the ground more treacherous. The world blurred around them, the sound of heavy footfalls growing closer with each passing second. Arya's thoughts whirled in a frantic spiral. How had it come to this? One moment she had been the heir to a throne, and now she was running for her life, side by side with a human she barely knew, from enemies she once trusted. As they reached a clearing, Ethan skidded to a stop, pulling her behind a large boulder. "Wait here," he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "What are you doing?" she hissed, fear clawing at her chest. He didn't answer. Instead, he crouched low, watching the tree line with sharp, focused eyes. Arya felt her breath catch in her throat as the masked figures emerged from the shadows, their weapons raised, moving silently across the clearing. Ethan didn't wait. He sprang from his hiding place with a sudden burst of energy, taking the first attacker by surprise. His blade flashed in the low light, striking with precision, and the man fell without a sound. Arya watched, frozen in awe and fear, as Ethan fought, his movements a fluid blend of grace and violence. But he couldn't fight them all. One by one, the remaining attackers surrounded him, their blades gleaming ominously. Arya's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what was happening. They were outnumbered, and Ethan was losing ground. A surge of panic coursed through her. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't stand by and watch him fall. Gripping her blade tightly, she stepped forward, her muscles tense and ready. But just as she prepared to charge, something unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the shadows, a third party neither she nor the attackers had anticipated. A soft whistle echoed through the clearing, and the next moment, one of the attackers dropped to the ground, an arrow embedded in his chest. Another followed, then another, each falling silently as the arrows found their mark. Arya's eyes widened in shock as the attackers began to retreat, realizing they were being targeted from the tree line. Ethan took the opportunity and turned to her. "Now, we need to move." Arya didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward him, her body aching from the exertion, but her mind focused on one thing: survival. Together they ran, dodging between the trees, their path winding and chaotic as they evaded their pursuers. Behind them, the mysterious archer continued to pick off the remaining attackers, but Arya didn't dare look back. Whoever they were, they had bought her and Ethan the time they needed to escape. For now, that was enough. They burst through the trees and into another clearing, this one smaller and more enclosed, with thick vines hanging from the branches above. Ethan paused, his chest heaving as he scanned their surroundings. "Are we safe?" Arya asked, her voice breathless with both exhaustion and fear. "For now," he replied, though his eyes remained wary, "but we need to keep moving. They won't give up that easily." Arya nodded, though her body screamed for rest. She had no choice but to trust Ethan's judgment. He had gotten them this far. and as much as it stung her pride to admit it, she needed him if she was going to survive this ordeal. Who were they? She asked, her mind still racing to make sense of the ambush. Ethan shook his head. Mercenaries, most likely. Hired by someone who wants you dead. Arya's stomach twisted at the thought. Of course. Cadus would stop at nothing to ensure she didn't return to Seraphis. He had already taken everything from her kingdom, her family, her future, and now it seemed he wouldn't rest until he had taken her life as well. But as she glanced at Ethan, his gaze sharp and unwavering, she felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone, not anymore. They set off again, their pace slower but steady as they navigated the dense forest. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on Arya, but she forced herself to push forward. There was no time for weakness, not here, not now. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the night growing darker around them, Arya found herself thinking of the archer who had saved them. Who were they? And why had they intervened? The questions gnawed at her, but for now there were no answers. Only the path ahead. And somewhere in the distance a kingdom still waited. The morning light filtered through the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in soft hues of gold and green. Arya blinked awake, her body sore from the night's harrowing escape. For a moment, disoriented by the dappled light and the rhythmic sounds of the forest, she forgot where she was. But reality crashed down quickly, the memories of the ambush and their narrow escape flashing before her eyes like a nightmare that refused to fade. Beside her, Ethan was already awake, crouched by a small stream that cut through the clearing. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested instinctively on the knife at his hip. Even here, in this quiet pocket of the wilderness, he was on edge, ever vigilant. Arya had never seen anyone like him, someone who seemed to live on the razor's edge of survival, yet carried himself with an ease that belied the danger. As she sat up, her muscles protesting the movement, Ethan turned to her. His face was expressionless, but his eyes softened slightly when he saw her awake. "Sleep well?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "As well as anyone can after almost being killed," Arya replied, a hint of dry humor in her tone. She pushed herself to her feet, wincing as the wound on her arm throbbed with the effort. It was healing, but slowly. Too slowly. Ethan stood brushing the dirt from his hands. "We need to move again soon. We can't stay here long." She nodded, though her body screamed for rest. There was no rest, not in this world. Not anymore. The thought weighed on her, a familiar ache that settled deep in her bones. Her kingdom was gone, her people scattered or dead. And yet here she was, still standing, still breathing, still fighting. I've been thinking about our next move," Ethan said, breaking into her thoughts. "We need to find somewhere safer, maybe get off this planet." Arya's heart twisted at the suggestion. Leaving Seraphis, her home, the only world she had ever known. Could she do that? Could she abandon the land her ancestors had ruled for centuries? But what choice did she have? Cadus had stolen everything from her. There was no throne to return to, no army waiting to reclaim her kingdom. She was alone, save for the human standing before her. And yet she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "I can't leave," Arya said quietly, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean you can't stay here? Not with Cadus's men hunting you." "I know." Arya looked down, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision she knew she had to make. "But I can't just run away. My people, what's left of them, they need me." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What people?" "Arya, we haven't seen anyone since we left the palace grounds. The ones who were loyal to you are either dead or in hiding. You can't fight this alone." "I won't be alone," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I have you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ethan's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But then to her surprise he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, his gaze softening. "You're serious about this?" "I have to be." Arya took a step closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Cadus won't stop until I'm dead. And even if I left, even if I ran to the ends of the galaxy, he would still hunt me. This is my fight, Ethan, my responsibility, and I can't turn my back on it." Ethan's gaze flickered with something she couldn't quite place, admiration perhaps, or respect. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "If you're staying, I'm staying." Arya blinked, her heart skipping a beat at his words. She hadn't expected that. She had assumed Ethan would leave, that he would see her decision as foolish and abandon her to her fate. But instead, here he was, offering to stand by her side, to fight with her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're right," Ethan said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "This isn't just your fight. It's ours. Cadus has to be stopped, and I'm not about to let you face him alone." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of their shared decision settling over them like a storm cloud. The bond between them, fragile yet unbreakable, had solidified in the wake of everything they had been through. They weren't just two strangers thrown together by circumstance anymore. They were something more. Arya felt a surge of gratitude and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, but that sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Don't thank me yet?" They spent the next hour preparing for their journey. Ethan had salvaged a few supplies from his crashed ship, and though they were running low, he seemed confident that they would find more as they made their way through the wilderness. Arya packed what little they had into a small satchel, her mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. They were going to fight back. Against Cadus, against the odds, against everything that had conspired to tear her world apart. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. She had spent her life in the safety of the palace, protected by walls and guards and the illusion of invincibility. Now that illusion was shattered, but in its place something stronger had grown resolve. Ethan extinguished the remnants of their campfire, scattering the ashes with his boot. He glanced up at Arya, his expression grim but determined. "Ready?" She nodded, though the weight of the task ahead threatened to crush her. "Ready." They set off into the forest, moving carefully through the dense foliage. The air was thick with humidity, the scent of earth and leaves filling Arya's lungs with every breath. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. But despite the danger, despite the uncertainty, Arya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As they walked, Ethan kept his eyes trained on the path ahead, his body tense with alertness. Arya found herself watching him more closely than before, noticing the subtle movements of his muscles, the way he seemed to anticipate every sound and movement in the forest. He was a man of action, a protector. And now he had chosen to protect her. They walked for hours, the forest around them growing denser, darker. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Arya's legs ached, her wound throbbed, but she forced herself to keep going. She couldn't afford to be weak, not now. As they reached the edge of a ravine, Ethan stopped, his eyes scanning the terrain. "We'll camp here for the night," he said, nodding toward a small clearing on the other side of the ravine. "It's secluded enough that we shouldn't be seen." Arya nodded, though her mind was already racing with thoughts of the next day. They needed a plan. If they were going to face Cadus, they couldn't just rush in blindly. They needed allies, resources, anything to give them an edge. As they settled in for the night, Ethan kept watch while Arya drifted in and out of a restless sleep. Her dreams were filled with flashes of the past, the palace, the betrayal, Cadus's cold, calculating smile. But woven into those nightmares was something new, the image of Ethan, standing beside her, unwavering and strong. The next morning, as the sun broke through the trees and bathed the forest in golden light, Arya awoke with a newfound sense of purpose. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she fled the palace. She wasn't the sheltered princess who had watched her world crumble from behind a veil of safety. She was something else now, something more. And with Ethan by her side, she would reclaim what had been taken from her, not just her kingdom, but her future. Together, they would rise,